Welcome to Healthy Living, the Azure Standard Podcast. Azure Standard, your source for organic, natural, earth-friendly products. Visit us at azurestandard.com. Azure Standard, for over 30 years, a family-owned, independent business where you're considered a part of our family. Membership is always free, and we'd love for you to join us on our journey toward abundant and healthy living.
Something is being hidden in this agenda. There's a hidden agenda. Otherwise, they would be bragging it up.
Today's podcast is part 3 of our 3-part series on GMOs, genetically modified organisms, their risks, and what you can do to protect your family. David Cross will be talking to Azure Standard founder and CEO David Stelzer, along with Jeffrey Smith, the founder and executive director of the Institute for Responsible Technology. With part 3 of our series, here's Azure founder and CEO David Stelzer.
The vast majority of genetically modified grains, plants, I should say, were released specifically to resist herbicides. Glyphosates in particular, mostly throughout, the genetically modified plants of the world that are being raised in large quantities. That's the number one attribute. That's the number one reason. And in my opinion, those herbicides are some of the most toxic things to humans that there could possibly be. And by creating plants that resist those and allow you to put more herbicides on and create a resistance to that herbicide, that's what really opened my eyes to there's a problem here. This is not being used in the right way, even if it was a good concept to begin with, which I'm not so sure it is at this point. But even if it was, it's being totally abused and totally misused.
If you look at the animal feeding studies, and I have many of these documented in that long article at Non-GMOs Improve Health, you can see, and I already mentioned some, potentially precancerous cell growth, premature death, organ damage, hormonal changes, immune system activation, changes in the enzyme. You can see all these different things, and what happens is the biotech industry has become masters at covering up the dangers. So in my book, Genetic Roulette, which you can get an e-copy, an e-version of the book by going to non-GMOsimprovehealth.com, and I'll just deliver you an e-book, and you can take a look at part 3. Part 3 is how the industry rigs their research to avoid finding problems, and it is so blatant. David, it is so blatant. It's like finding someone with a smoking gun at the scene of a murder, and then them saying, "Oh, wasn't us. We weren't even there."
Right.
Of course you were there. We have photographic evidence. Nope, we weren't there. It is so blatant how they rig their research, how they do things that are entirely unscientific, and somehow get the regulatory agencies to cut and paste their conclusion. And then you find out, for example, like because of the Monsanto papers that came out because of the trial, that Monsanto had their own lapdog. Do you know that the EPA had determined that glyphosate does not cause cancer? Who was in charge of that? David or Jess Rowland. And Jess turns out to be Monsanto's lapdog, working on the inside on behalf of Monsanto, trying to suppress research from another agency, basically saying that he should deserve a medal if he can stop the research. And basically, they were talking about him as if they were basically his person in the inside, and he was in charge. So even though they do terrible science and they cover up the science, somehow, because of their influence, we're still eating it unless we're paying attention.
Woodward and Bernstein, you remember the Watergate scandal, follow the money. And so, follow the money. I think that's what we have here is an old boys network that's protecting commercial interests and pushing this stuff through. Let me ask you, Jeffrey, you're the founder of the Institute for Responsible Technology, and I want to just focus on the word responsible there. Is there a place for GMO? Is there a place where GMO, something good could come from GMO? Or are you fundamentally opposed to GMO?
I think I am very specific in my recommendations. I am not against the use of genetic engineering to improve a defect in a human condition that will save a person's life or improve their quality of life, but I would be against it if it were inheritable, changing the future of the human species, especially at this time when we're babes in the woods, not really understanding the nature of DNA and how genes function. Similarly, I'm not against using genetic engineering for research or for producing specific drugs in the laboratory, but there's, as I said, surprise side effects. So even when they created a supplement, L-tryptophan, in the 1980s from a genetic engineering process, they did not fully respect the things that can go wrong, and the contamination that occurred almost completely as a result of the genetic engineering process, as far as we can tell, ended up causing a deadly epidemic, killing about 100 Americans and causing 5,000 to 10,000 to fall sick, and some became permanently disabled. Where I draw the line is in exposing this infant technology to either the food supply or to replicate in nature. So our Institute for Responsible Technology, and you can read about this at responsibletechnology.org, is dead set against using the products of genetic engineering in the human food supply, and we have plenty of evidence to show that it's a wise choice, and to stop all releases of GMOs in the environment, because what happens is the seeds will move, the pollen will cross, animals will mate, and you end up contaminating the gene pool, which is an irreversible condition. And what happens is we continue to understand more and more about the DNA, but we've already released the stuff. So after the Roundup Ready corn was on the market, we discovered the increase in putrescine and cadaverine. After the Bt toxin corn was on the market, we discovered that it produces an allergen called gamazine. After the animals are out of the pen, then we discover, they're causing damage. And even if we are able to stop the commercialization, there always will be a contamination element in the gene pool unless we come up with some futuristic sci-fi way to clean up the gene pool. Now, at this point, David, they want to, I remember hearing from someone that attended a 1999 San Francisco biotech conference where Monsanto's consultant described how they had created a plan to genetically engineer 100% of all commercial seeds in the world and patent them. Now, their master plan to do it in fast time was derailed by the European revolt, but they have only expanded their goal to now include insects. Genetically modified mosquitoes have already been released, and there's a new version that's on its way I read about today. They want to introduce genetically modified fish. They've already done salmon. They've got 35 others in the pipeline. Algae, bacteria, fungus, trees. Basically anything with DNA is up for grabs. And so there is a huge gold rush called a gene rush, where they're going after anything with the DNA, trying to find a patent, putting it out there, and then commercializing something before the patent expires so they can make their money. Now, because of gene editing, CRISPR-Cas9 is an example people have heard of, it is so cheap that we now are about to, if we allow this to happen, then we will be passing on to future generations not the products of the billions of years of evolution, but the products of the gene rush, where the algae will be maybe out, the genetically engineered algae might outcompete the natural, and who knows what side effects it has for the oceans. The genetically modified mosquitoes may carry something in the saliva, so it might affect humans. All of these what-ifs, but there's no time to act. There's no time to act right now to wait to do the human clinical trials and wait, because these companies are mad about getting these things out before their competitors do. So we're in one of the most precarious times in human history, not just for other things that people are thinking about like climate, but because the integrity of the gene pool is at stake. So we're very specific about what we are against, and we have very strong evidence that the current generation is not sufficiently safe and predictable. I'm not against the possibility, David, that someday we may be able to safely and predictably manipulate the DNA for the betterment of health and the environment, but we are nowhere near that at this point.
Some years ago, there was the famous case of the Indian wheat farmers who had started to had been saving their seeds for millennia, and then Monsanto took legal action against them for copyright infringement because they were saving the variant seeds. I mean, that's another angle that we can speak to, where the companies who develop these technologies then gain the full commercial interest over our food supply. We're playing with God's Lego in a little way here. That we've got the building blocks, and we're faffing with the fundamental building blocks. And when those genetically modified meat, fish, and veg. I was actually just fishing for wild salmon in the Pacific on the Columbia River the other week with my family, and it's really scary to think of once these modified, hacked genes get out there into our food supply, who knows what the effects are going to be. It's frightening.
I know, and I mean, we can actually point to research done in Canada where they genetically engineered the salmon in a similar way to the salmon that's already on the market. Not quite the same, but different with the government done. And they released the frankenfish into tanks, either on their own or along with natural salmon. And the tanks sort of replicated what it was like in the actual open waters. And they found that when they had sufficient food, both salmon were fine. But when the food supply was reduced, then there was a problem. The genetically engineered salmon were engineered with a growth hormone to be produced constantly, and usually it shuts down for part of the time, but in these it's going constantly. It's like, fish on crack, and so they're ravenously hungry. And so they got hungry, and they started to cannibalize both the natural salmon and their genetically engineered counterparts, and they caused a complete extinction or a population crash in each of the tanks. They also demonstrated behavior that was far more aggressive in moving into parts of the tank that the other salmon weren't going to. So imagine if the eggs got released or the salmon got released. Let's say someone has the brilliant idea of putting it into open pens or closed pens on the coast. There's been millions of salmon that have released through pens that have opened, and salmon has escaped. And let's say they cross with the traditional salmon. So now you have rows of potentially highly aggressive, fast-growing salmon that are going to try and eat out the rest of the salmon and the non-salmon competitors. It can have a devastating effect not just on salmon, but the entire ecosystem of the oceans. So this is just one example of the runaway side effects that can occur. And now there's something called the gene drive, where they actually want to program traits and consciously release products, or let's say mosquitoes or rats, to wipe out the mosquito population or wipe out the rat population on an island, and change in huge swaths overnight our entire ecosystem. And I was at the Convention for Biological Diversity watching the side event by these groups trying to promote gene drives as the way to go forward for conservation purposes. Absolutely incredible, and very few people are on their side, but they have the science that they're developing, and there's no laws against using it at this point, so it's a very scary situation.
Absolutely. You've led us through a very interesting journey here on GMOs, and thank you. Are there any other points you'd like to bring up, or what's next in your fight against GMO, and how can Azure customers stay in touch with you?
I would say this. Go to responsibletechnology.org and sign up for the newsletter. Absolutely. And if you're interested in finding out methods and ways to heal from the deadly impacts or the dangerous impacts of GMOs and Roundup, not just avoiding GMOs and going organic, but other ways, then sign up for the next broadcast of Healing from GMOs and Roundup, which is at healingfromgmos.com. So responsibletechnology.org, healingfromgmos.com, and we will let you know as soon as the film Secret Ingredients comes out, which is the fastest conversion tool to organic that we've seen. I've told you so many different websites, but the key is give us your email so we can let you know what is happening, because right now we need to mobilize our entire generation to protect all future generations, and there's a lot of things that people need to know that are not going to come out in the major media. And thank you, David, for having this podcast so that your very attentive and educated audience can get the kind of information that they need.
I really appreciate your time, Jeffrey. Thank you so much, and I look forward to following your work in future.
Thank you so much, David.
In our discussion, Jeffrey presented some quite frankly scary ideas, especially about the seemingly lax and loose set of rules surrounding GMO, and how big business seems to be pushing ahead with GMO technologies simply for profit and to capture market share. Back to David Stelzer. I asked David to give his own insights on how he sees the future debate and rules concerning GMO.
It's hard for me to predict, but right now the trend seems to be pretty loose, unfortunately. And what that does to our, if you really think about the genetics that make up our food supply, the genetics of wheat and corn or maize and rice and some of the staples that are in our food supply today are very complex. It's taken thousands and thousands of years of farmers to, working through those genetics, developing better grain, better beans, based on selective breeding, and in some cases, hybridization and various traditional breeding methodologies that have taken many of these crops to a point where, it can feed, a lot more people. And with the introduction of genetically modified traits into this gene pool, it really opens a Pandora's box that is a little bit scary if you think about it. Will some of these traits get into the wild forebears of some of these food grains? Is it possible? It's totally possible. Corn is one that's so very genetically modified all over the place, and genetically modified pollen has been found in ancient, Mexican fields where where the original genetics of corn came from. And to me that's worrisome, not being able to contain it, creating a Pandora's box of genetics. As a farmer, I appreciate the genetics of our crops very much. There was a lot of thought, a lot of work, and it was handed down from generation to generation. No one man could have ever done it. It was something that had to be done, that our forefathers handed down from generation to generation for many of our food crops, not just one or two, but almost all of our food crops have been selectively bred for particular traits throughout the years, and have created what we have today. And I think, there's a lot, it'll go a lot further. It could go a lot further. But now we have this Pandora's box where we have these stray genes that are now being entered. Will that completely screw up traditional plant breeding for future generations? And it's possible that it could, and that is scary to me.
Jeffrey Smith spoke about the human microbiome and how it is impacted by GMOs. And this was a concern echoed by David in his closing comments about GMOs.
The third concern that I would really have is, what does that affect the stray genes in the food supply that we put in due to our microbiome that digests our food? Is our microbiome able to adapt fast enough to be able to digest these stray genes in our food supply that have suddenly come at us in, the space of just a very few years when you look at how microbiomes develop over centuries, and the health effects that could have in the long term, especially in the second, third generation, for the human microbiome, and how that will affect our children and their ability to digest food. And we're seeing a lot of diseases right now that we never saw in the past. Okay, you conquer a few diseases, and certainly modern cleanliness and methods and different things have conquered a few diseases, but we've gotten more than what we've conquered. And that's, how many of those are related to genetically modified? I feel like a lot of them are related to agricultural practices. But genetically modified definitely plays into that picture, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that.
Thank you for listening to Healthy Living with Azure Standard. We want to thank our special guests, Jeffrey Smith, and our interviewer, David Cross, for joining us. If you'd like to visit Jeffrey's site, please go to the Institute for Responsible Technology, and that's responsibletechnology.org. If you'd like to learn more about Azure Standard, we invite you to visit our website at azurestandard.com, where you can shop for healthy food and over 12,000 products carefully chosen with your health and abundance in mind. Membership's always free, and we're always happy to answer questions to help you get started on your own pathway to more abundant living. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, take care.